Hello, my name is Jeff Koch. I am professor of political science at the State University of New York at Geneseo. And I am here to talk about the book, The Splendid and the Vile by Erik Larson. I wish we could be in person. I wish that I was at the Brighton Memorial Library with you and meeting with you and could give you my thoughts, share my thoughts with you on the book, and then hear your thoughts on the book and questions about the book and reactions to the book and reactions to things that I've said. But here we are in the age of COVID-19, and so it just doesn't allow for that. And in fact, there's things about our current situation in the United States with the pandemic and our political situation that were brought to mind, or you've made even more salient, or provided points of contrast. And when I read the book, I am not a professor where my expertise lies in British politics. My expertise and focus is in American politics, particularly in American elections and public opinion. So I don't really claim or really have a great historical knowledge about British politics or European politics, or specifically about World War II. But I will make some contrast between the situation in Britain at the time of the book and some things with respect to American politics, as well as make some comments about the what I saw as kind of the interesting parts of the book and reactions to it. And again, I wish that we were all together and could talk about it. But again, we're all trying to do the best we can during the pandemic, and hopefully there's light at the end of the tunnel. And soon, many people will be vaccinated, and then life will return to normal. And of course, in the book, you got to wonder, what the British people thought at the time when they were being bombed by Nazi Germany, and at a time when Nazi Germany had taken over mainland Europe, the continent, and was clearly threatening to invade Britain. What their thoughts were about when life might return to normal, and they certainly must have experienced quite a bit of anxiety and concern, and were probably also knew life was not as they wanted it, and wanted to return to normal, but certainly wondered if it ever would return to normal. So let me get on with the book. Let me also say, I found the book extremely well written, extremely well researched, and I learned a great deal. Again, I'm not a expert on British politics. It's not my area of expertise. I certainly know some things about World War II and Churchill and Britain. And so just as anybody, I guess, would, or most people would, about that time period. And I certainly learned quite a bit. And so in that way, I really liked the book, that I got something from it. Again, it was very well researched and very, very well written. So it was always a pleasure to read, and have great admiration for Erik Larson for the product that he was able to put together. I have read one of his other books. I read The Devil in the White City, which was also quite good, and also a piece of nonfiction. That book focusing on, and it took place, the story took place in Chicago in the United States, when they were constructing a World's Fair, and it focused on that, as well as a serial killer in Chicago, and that is the devil. And the White City was the World's Fair exhibit that was being put together, and it kind of was contrasting the good and the bad, and so what humanity is capable of and what they might be able to do, and also what they might be able to do that was bad. So it was quite interesting as well. But okay, let me get on with the Splendid and the Vile. And, again, I think I couldn't read it, and I assume many of you probably also thought about it in comparing our current times during the pandemic with the situation in Britain. And, for Britain, it was very memorable. There was remarkable times. I'm sure, people were being bombed nightly. They knew it was coming, and probably after a couple bombing raids, they became pretty predictable, and probably people learned how to react to it. It certainly was quite threatening. It probably made it easier to read, I suppose, given that we knew the outcome. We knew that eventually Nazi Germany would be defeated and Britain would prevail. Still, at the same time, we knew that the people in Britain didn't know that, as they were experiencing it at that time in 1940 and 1941, that they were under siege. It must have just been, remarkable and very, very gripping. Churchill, to me, appeared to be the right person, the right man at the right time, with the right set of skill set to be the leader of Britain at that time. He had been a Secretary of War, so his expertise did lay in military affairs and strategic affairs. So he had a good understanding of that, and was very capable of understanding probably what was needed, and at least militarily and strategically, for Britain to prevail. And so he really seemed to be, again, the right man at the right time. Just like now, we have considered this probably just a remarkable time due to the pandemic, and probably also due to the Trump years. They both were kind of remarkable times where people felt really threatened. It's also kind of striking to me that even in those remarkable times, our current time period in the United States, as well as the time in Britain where they were being bombed and the sovereignty of the nation was threatened and its future unsure, that for many people, life went on still. So people still married, people still had children, they formed families. Probably they lost family and lost relatives, and not necessarily due to the bombing, but just as part of quote unquote normal life. We get that kind of in a very colorful way through the stories of Churchill himself and his family members, his son, his daughter-in-law, and through a number of his aides. One of the key sources used by Erik Larson are diaries. And so diaries involve not only people's, stories about things that are can be made into public information, and the reactions to their jobs and what's going on at that time in Britain with public affairs, but also their private lives are detailed. So we learn about people's pursuit of relationships and disappointment with relationships. We learn about affairs. We learn about marriages gone awry and not really working out very well. And, we see that people are kind of, again, still doing the things that are kind of the normal part of people's kind of business and living. And that, again, to form families and to sustain those families, to form relationships and to take care of those relationships. And of course, we see that during the pandemic, even though it's a very, very hard time. I think it's got to be a very difficult time for young people these days, who want to date and be kind of out there, where social relationships are seriously and significantly curtailed, as a result. So that's got to be a real challenge for them. So I'm going to talk about kind of some of the general political stuff and historical events of that time period. But it was also, I suppose, interesting to note that Churchill had a son who seemed to be a bit of a scoundrel with a gambling problem, a drinking problem, a problem in being faithful to his wife and children. And well, we might look at Churchill as being truly remarkable and truly great, and those things he was, and really very important for the history of Britain and the history of World War II and Britain's ability to prevail, or at least sustain himself during that time. We also see kind of him having a child that was basically a failure and probably was a great source of pain. Probably, perhaps a child that he just didn't know what to do with, and maybe he turned away. He couldn't have felt proud, and he had to feel bothered. It certainly seemed to contrast with his own kind of steeliness and professionalism and dedication. And so, that must have been very hard to see a son who was overly indulgent, and maybe perhaps he wondered if he had indulged too much. But probably for those of us who are parents, we know that some things don't necessarily always turn out well with one's children. And, you just kind of, maybe sometimes it's best to put your hands up and say, I did the best job I could. And it just didn't come out that well. Probably it's easier for us when our children do things that we're really proud of to, give ourselves a pat on the back there. But maybe sometimes we give ourselves more credit than we deserve, and maybe sometimes more blame than we deserve. But I guess my point is kind of that, not all things were great in his life. He was a great prime minister and again, provided tremendous leadership to, Britain, but, there were some problems that were there. We also, because of the use of diaries, we get a glimpse into the personal lives of a number of his advisors, and I think they're kind of a very important part of the story. Really mostly there, I suppose, in how they did their job and how they did their work, their professional work. But we also learn about their pursuit of relationships and their success, satisfactions and disappointments with what happened to them. And it's again quite revealing, and you see people again carrying out their lives as they would, as kind of as if things were perfectly normal during these extraordinarily difficult times that they had. They were seeking marriage and having children, and during a time of great stress. One of the things again that really seemed remarkable for that time period was the unity that was there in Britain. And you see evidence of really very little differences between the parties, the Labour Party, Conservative Party in Britain at that time. The country seemed to be very unified. And of course, I think that's something that we generally see in a country when it faces an external threat. And really, it's hard to see a more serious external threat coming to a country that another country wants to take you over, and you're going to lose your sovereignty. And there again, the threat was both very real, very concrete. Reminded of it through, nightly bombing raids or periodic bombing raids on London and other parts of Britain. People well aware that Germany had taken over much of continental Europe, and it was clearly quite expansionist and trying to cast its influence throughout. But he enjoyed pretty widespread support. And so it seemed to be a case again where the political parties came together. And that's not unusual in any country. Once there is an external threat, there's kind of the saying, and politics ends at the water's edge, meaning that, we stop fighting with each other, because if we can't protect our sovereignty, we're not going to have anything really worth fighting for. So, there's a number of reminders of that. I mean, it was also quite a contrast there, at least in my mind, during the pandemic. You know, a number of our divisions within the United States have been revealed. So wearing a mask, social distancing have become political issues, and people's, you know, responses to those are shaped partly by their politics and whether they are Republican or Democrat. And so, you know, we've kind of faced the pandemic and had a lot of divisions over it, where they kind of, you know, had a problem there and had a threat, and it created a lot of unity that was there. So it had, you know, what you know, we would generally think of as kind of a rally around the flag effect, and that Britons came together in order to, you know, really, you know, quite a bit of effort to preserve themselves against an ultimate threat to their sovereignty. Whereas here in the United States, you know, have done a poor job, I think, in facing the pandemic, and there's been quite a bit of divisiveness. I'm not sure it really had to be that way. I do think Trump made a serious political mistakes by making it divisive. He perhaps would have won re-election had it been the case that he would have said, you know, something along the lines of, yeah, we're threatened, there's a threat there, it's very serious, people will die, there will be a loss of life, but we will win, and casting somewhat both a both optimistic, hopeful message as well as with a dose of realism. And so that's also kind of, I think, kind of the one thing that was most striking about Churchill's leadership style. He was both hopeful and realistic. He did not really play down the threat. He did not really use a lot of propaganda to exaggerate the threat. Maybe, again, he did not need to do that. He was pretty hard-headed about it, and pretty hard-headed in talking to people about it, that there is a threat there. We're fighting for our sovereignty. We really need a lot. He appealed to Brits to do the best that they could. I think he made them feel that their contributions were important, that they were not only important to themselves, you know, that they do things, but also to Britain, also to the future of Britain. And then that's what they were fighting for. And so in that way, he was very, very motivating to them. He acknowledged the severity of the situation without exaggerating it. And maybe, again, he did not need to. He probably, in some ways, was not totally honest, in the sense that he did not share everything that he thought. He thought, probably very much correctly, that the United States entering the war was necessary in order for Britain to survive, and in order for Germany, Italy, and Japan to be defeated. And his goal, as he made clear, or at least how he made clear privately to his aides, and as Larson articulates on a number of occasions, was to try to get Britain to survive until the United States entered the war. And without the United States entering the war, they probably could not survive. And again, I'm not really a student of World War II or Britain or Europe, but everything that I've read, there's many people who have also told me that, who know far more about World War II, say that is absolutely true. That once the United States entered the war, that gradually began to tip the balance, and differently in a way from Germany, Japan, and Italy. The United States, you know, economy began to rev up, and it had the industrial might and a population to kind of provide a great deal of resources towards the war, and really tipped the balance. The decision to bomb Pearl Harbor was probably a serious tactical mistake by the other side. Perhaps the United States would have eventually entered anyway, perhaps not. And certainly, as the authors make clear, there was still at that time a very isolationist current in the United States, of a lot of people who wanted the United States to stay out of other nations' troubles and just kind of deal with our home environment. The United States did not really try to do much to project its power abroad. The United States did not even really at that time think of itself as a world power, whereas the United States was still struggling to get out of the Great Depression. But once, you know, the war began, the United States did intervene, and projected its power. But Churchill did not say, what we really need is the United States to enter, and without the United States entering, we're going to be lost. He kept that private, or kept that to himself and his aides. So, that might have been too unnerving to know that your fate actually depends upon the actions of another country rather than depends upon your own actions. And so again, he was probably right. And again, he had an honesty, though, I think, and a bluntness still, and a hard-headed bluntness about the realities of the situation, most of which he did share with the people. So, he did not really use propaganda. He did not really lie to the public and deceive them. He didn't really, maybe he didn't need to, but there's kind of a bluntness about it that I think is quite appreciative. One of the things that I think, is also quite interesting in the book and really kind of gave it a specialness was to read about the views of the opposition. So periodically, Larson takes us over to Germany and talks about Rudolf Hess and Goring and Goebbels and Hitler and what was going on in their lives. Some of what he talks about is certainly personal with them. So I guess having some access to their diaries or some other information. But he's able to articulate then and share with us the views that they had of Churchill and what was going on in Britain and how they were frustrated by his success in being able to sustain themselves during the bombing and kind of how he was able to rally Brits and keep them engaged. So that was really quite striking and revealing to see their frustration. There's a little bit less of that, but there is some also with regard to Churchill and certainly, with regard to Roosevelt and a number of Roosevelt's aides like Hopkins and Harriman who were sent over to Britain, to meet with Churchill. And their lives also, certainly with Harriman, who ended up becoming involved with Churchill's daughter. So that was really, quite interesting. And again, probably, because he had access to diaries, had this kind of personal element into their intimate lives that, certainly was interesting there. One of the, I compared it a little bit to the pandemic, but the pandemic is kind of a quiet killer. It's an invisible killer. I think probably, we read about it, but you can't see the virus generally. You can see the results of virus and feel the results of virus if one, is infected by it, or one has other friends or family that are infected by it and unfortunately lose their life. But for Britain, the threat was very concrete. Bombs fell, buildings blew up, fires burned. You could hear the planes, you could hear the bombs, you could see some of the carnage and devastation that was there. So it was a very, very convincing and profound mobilizer. And again, I've read about people, who really still are in disbelief about the virus. Some people certainly take it very, very seriously and have from the very beginning, even though it is not visible. They still believe it. And I've seen some other people who are kind of dismissive of it and kind of think that it's not necessarily there. And maybe, again, it's hard for them to realize that it's actually there because it's not concrete and specific, and it's not really something that's very visible. But it's a little more abstract, and it's kind of an invisible killer, if you will. One of two parts of Churchill that I think were most striking and admirable. One part of that I've already mentioned was his the way he was able to rally Brits and keep them engaged in terms of persevering during the course of the bombing and holding out hope, although being realistic that they faced some very serious challenges, and having Britons know that their contributions were really important for the nation, getting them to give there. He sometimes, traveled to parts of the country to witness the devastation in the cities in London, to see that. I'm going to take a little drink of water. And I think he demonstrated great empathy for people. According to the author, sometimes he also put himself at risk by viewing the bombings during times of bombings that were there. And so that probably was also made, imagine Brits feel that he had some empathy and sympathy for them and their lives and their situation. And he was not just simply a privileged person who was, kind of protected from the suffering that was going on. He certainly demonstrated great resolve and great confidence. And he was able to get other Britons to, share in that resolve and confidence that they could prevail. But the other thing that I thought was most striking about Churchill was his use of his aides. And he really seemed to be great at picking people to do certain jobs and identifying people who would be very good at certain things and certain important key tasks. And so, for example, there was Beaverbrook, who helped with the manufacture of planes and then eventually other types of armaments that were important. And he just seemed to be extremely resourceful, imaginative, entrepreneurial. He had a job, he was persistent with it, he devoted himself to it and just seemed to be very, very skilled in doing that job. Several times, he threatened to resign and to take leave of absence, that he had enough doing this and was exhausted. As one can imagine, he might be a tremendous amount of pressure, that was there placed upon him. And so, probably sometimes, he wanted to leave and have somebody else take over that job. But Churchill was able to have him stay and persuaded him. Another one was the professor, who was more of an engineering scientific type of person, who came up with some creative technologies, particularly dealing with Germany's developing ability to use positioning to identify targets and guide pilots to their targets, and sort of the Germans' advances in that technology. And so he was able to come up with ways to kind of thwart Germany's efforts there. And so he was really quite good. So he really kind of, I think, utilized his staff and aides quite well. And again, identifying people who could really do that job really, really well. There's a term that's used to define, that kind of is about a thing to do if one is born into good circumstances. And it's called noblesse oblige. It's a French term, but it's commonly used by the British. And noblesse oblige means that if you are born into nobility, you are obligated to give to society. And so in the United States, we often admire people who have moved from the bottom to the top, and have, had that Horatio Algier story of kind of moving up and been very successful. And in Britain, they kind of have had a society that has been, at least historically, more governed by class, having previously had a monarchy through many centuries. But there is a belief in, again, what's called noblesse oblige, and that is that if you are born into privileged circumstances, you are obligated, to give to society, and you can you benefited from, a good education or good economic circumstances, and had parents that were privileged, and then allowed oneself to be privileged. And so, but you're obligated to give back. And so Churchill seems to really have been motivated by that. His parents were very wealthy. He went to some of the finest schools, or the finest schools in Britain. He was certainly a very smart fellow. He grew up privileged and attended, again, great schools, was well cared for, and was aware of that, and felt that he was obligated, to give in return for the blessings that he had received. So that seemed to really have been shaping his life. Again, I found it sort of a really remarkable story, given, again, one knows the outcome of that story. still you can really get a feel for probably what people, how they felt, and the anxiety that they had, and the concern that they had as to whether or not they would make it during that period of time where everything, was in the balance. I will say, I've read a little bit more about Churchill, since reading the book, and so one of the things that I've kind of learned is that historians consider this time period for Churchill, that year, as probably his finest hour. And so while his prime ministership went beyond that time, his grades are still good as a wartime leader, but not as good. And so well, he appears to be, again, the perfect man at that time, the right man in the right place at the right time for Britain. His grades are kind of a little bit lower later. I think from what I've read, a number of people are also a bit, do not feel that he did a good job with handling Britain's attempt to kind of get themselves out of colonialism. And Britain was a colonizer like most of the European powers through many centuries. And then beginning a lot in the post-World War II era, a lot of people, wanted to, or, those nations were clamoring for their independence. And his record there was not quite as good. And kind of has received more criticism. But hey, maybe we can't do everything perfectly. So that's kind of my thoughts on the book. Again, I enjoyed it. It piqued my interest in Churchill and the war in Britain during that time. It also piqued my interest in a number of the German counterparts, Goebbels and Göring, and Hitler and Hess. And so I tried to learn a bit more about their stories. And I thought that was kind of a very interesting contrast to kind of see the other side, because I guess that showed you kind of the effect that he was having, that he was, kind of a thorn in the side for the German Nazi leadership, and that they were not able to prevail as easily as they thought they would. And so that probably seemed to frustrate them greatly, and maybe that contributed to some poor decisions on their part, one of them being, excuse me, to invade Russia and then do what Göring saw as a mistake, having a war on two fronts and perhaps overextending themselves. And then, the big thing was Japan's bombing of the United States and clearly drawing the United States into World War II, and that probably spelling the end of it for the other side. I wish I could handle your questions. If you have any thoughts, you can share them with me. Again, I did enjoy the book very much, and appreciated the opportunity to talk about it. And so I wish you all a nice day. I hope you're surviving the pandemic, and I hope the pandemic will soon be over and our life will return to normal. And I'm sure the Brits, wanted their life to return to normal, and probably at a certain point they couldn't imagine what normal was anymore, as they were experiencing the new normal just as we are. Okay, again, thank you very much. Jeff Koch from SUNY Geneseo, professor of political science.